Welcome to CLESTalk, Law for Sustainable Cities, a podcast that focuses on all things cities, law, and environmental sustainability. In this podcast, we venture into different urban and environmental legal themes and feature special guests, including our own CLES researchers. For those who may not know, CLES is a research chair under the National Research Foundation's Research Chair Initiative and operates under the Faculty of Law at the Northwest University, South Africa. My name is Dr. Rumbidzai Wendy Musangaza. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at CLES and your host for this session. Our theme for today is Litigating the Future, Climate Harms and City Responsibility. This episode explores how cities could face climate change litigation in the future and be held responsible for not mitigating climate harms in the context of sustainable urban development. In today's episode, we are hosting Prof. Melanie Murcott, an associate professor at the University of Cape Town under the Institute of Marine and Environmental Law. Prof. Murcott, thank you for honoring our invitation. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast today, and we look forward to a very enriching discussion.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Thank you, Prof. So let's just start by diving into the heart of our discussion today. Climate change litigation has become a buzzword in recent years, and litigation is increasingly being used as a tool for climate action. Based on your expertise in climate change law and governance, could you please explain what climate change litigation entails and its relevance to urban sustainability?
Sure. So climate litigation is understood broadly to refer to cases before courts and other tribunals where climate change law, policy, or science is a material issue of law and fact, or fact. And it's a growing global phenomenon as actors are taking to the courts and other tribunals to hold governments and multinational corporations accountable for the causes and impacts of climate change and the human rights implications of climate change. The causes of climate change, of course, include the extraction and burning of fossil fuels, while the impacts include deaths due to changes in the climate system, loss of livelihoods and cultural heritage, food and water insecurity, and loss of housing, including because of sea level rise. And that is, if you'll pardon the pun, just the tip of the iceberg. Climate change has been primarily caused by global north states and actors, while the impacts are felt most severely in the global south, despite people in the region being least responsible. And this uneven distribution of the causes and impacts of climate change can be understood as climate injustice. And litigation is one among many tools to promote accountability among those responsible for climate change and the responses to climate change, and a tool to raise awareness of climate change as an existential threat to humanity, promote societal shifts, and that includes in law and policy.
Thank you, Prof. That is a very great overview. So given that cities could be seen as both contributors to and victims of climate change, could you please elaborate on the specific ways in which cities contribute to climate change? Also, why might cities be held liable for climate harms, and how does the law facilitate this process?
Sure. So I wanted to highlight that climate change is very relevant to issues of urban sustainability, and of course, climate litigation is relevant in this context too. Climate litigation is a mechanism that can hold municipalities and other actors accountable in urban settings for gaps or failures to address the causes and impacts of climate change that make people in cities more vulnerable to the disastrous effects of climate change. And there are already some examples of how climate litigation is working to hold cities accountable. including in South Africa. So in 2020, we had the Philippine Horticultural Food and Farming Campaign take the city of Cape Town to court for the city's failure to consider water scarcity in a time of climate change. And it failed to do so in the context of making urban planning decisions. And the argument was that this failure to consider climate change and water scarcity was unlawful on the part of the city, because the failure could have disastrous impacts for an aquifer on which food security in Cape Town depends. And so ultimately, the court set aside the city's approval of an urban development because the city hadn't considered climate change, and asked the city to take into account the issue of water scarcity in a time of climate change when it reconsidered whether to approve the land use for urban development that would threaten the aquifer. Another example of climate litigation is actually by cities. And we have, again, Cape Town being a relevant actor. So also in 2020, the city of Cape Town sued the Minister of Energy with a view to facilitating an increase in renewable energy. And the city wanted to be able to purchase renewable energy without first seeking the minister's consent to obtain renewable energy directly from suppliers. So essentially, the city wanted to transform energy policy. What happened in the case is that the court sent the parties back, the city and the minister, back to engage in an intergovernmental dispute resolution process. But as we know, litigation can have effects far beyond what happens in the courtroom and the judgments. And following this decision to send the parties back to intergovernmental dispute resolution processes, there was a shift in energy policy, allowing cities to acquire limited amounts of renewable energy directly. And so there was a positive shift towards improved climate action as a result of the city's efforts. So cities can be both held accountable through climate litigation, but they can also be drivers of climate action through climate litigation. And of course, on the accountability side, we must know and appreciate that climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions, again, produced by the burning of fossil fuels, and that large quantities of emissions are produced in and for the benefit of urban areas. So cities are part of the problem of climate change. They can also be part of the solution, depending on how they are designed, the public services they provide, and many other factors. For instance, good public transport can reduce emissions from cars, while poor spatial planning that many cities in South Africa suffer from due to apartheid, and weak public transport systems that require more people to commute long distances will worsen climate change. So there we see how cities can be responsive, but also can be complicit in the problem. So how does the law address some of these issues? Well, cities owe constitutional and legislative duties to respond to climate change. And I'll just focus on some of the constitutional duties that stem from cities' broad developmental mandates provided for in the Constitution. These include promoting a safe and healthy environment for people who live in cities, and providing municipal services to communities in a sustainable manner. So cities are required to, for example, provide water and sanitation services, stormwater drainage services, and address air pollution in their municipalities. In addition, the Constitution imposes obligations in the Bill of Rights, and important rights include the environmental right provided for in Section 24 of the Constitution, and the rights to access to food and water provided for in Section 27 of the Constitution. Cities have obligations to take reasonable legislative and other measures to fulfill these rights. They must do positive things to advance these rights. They also have obligations to realize the right to adequate housing. And of course, climate change is a known threat to the realization of these rights. It threatens health, it threatens well-being that are protected by the environmental right. It threatens water security and food security, and it's no secret that many people are being displaced and losing their homes, threatening housing because of climate change. So those are some of the ways in which the law imposes duties that could lead to liability on the part of cities for climate harms. Cities could be held liable precisely because they owe constitutional and legislative duties to members of the public, and because they have constitutional competencies such as provision of stormwater drainage services and sewage services to people in their municipalities. They must also provide things like emergency housing. And when cities intentionally or negligently fail to fulfill these obligations and people are harmed by climate shocks as a result, cities could face liability under the law for their wrongful acts. The law of delict, or tort as it's referred to elsewhere in the world, hasn't yet been used to hold cities in South Africa accountable for damages from climate harms, but could evolve in this direction. And elsewhere in the world, people are claiming damages from cities for things like failure to warn, damages to property, and public nuisance.
Thank you very much, Prof. It's interesting to see how climate change litigation is being used by cities as one of their tools for local climate change governance. And it does sound like the legal landscape is evolving to hold cities accountable for climate harms. So cities are both the defendants and plaintiffs in these cases that you have just discussed. But I imagine cities might also have defenses to protect themselves. What kind of defenses do you think cities might raise in climate change litigation cases?
So, of course, cities won't always be liable for every harm that arises because of climate change. And in layman's terms, to avoid liability, whether in a judicial review case or a delictual case, so whether a litigant is saying that the city has performed an unlawful act violating the Constitution or a delictual wrong that has caused financial harm, the city will need to demonstrate that they have done everything in their power to address the climate harms that have arisen. In other words, they'll need to show that they've fulfilled the legislative and constitutional duties to those who live in their municipalities. And this would include taking into account climate change risks, putting in place effective measures to address those risks. And in damages claims, cities may be able to argue that they are not the factual cause of the harm suffered by people who seek damages from them. So there are many levers that cities could pull to excuse themselves from liability. But as someone who is concerned about the climate system and the terrible impacts that climate change will have on human rights, I think the starting point is for cities to be able to come to the court with clean hands and to present evidence to show that they have done everything in their power to fulfill the constitutional duties they owe, and therefore that they are not the cause of the relevant harm. Whether it's homes being washed away due to sea level rise, they can, if the city is coming to court with clean hands, it might be to say, we put in place the necessary adaptation measures to prevent this disaster, and those measures failed because of 1, 2, and 3, not because of our negligence. So that is what I would like to see cities doing to avoid liability and to defend themselves. But of course, one of the things we can expect to see if cities are sued for damages in delit cases is that they will argue they are not the factual cause of the harm.
Thank you, Prof. That is really insightful. And having had a brush with climate change litigation, just as any litigation, I would say there are, challenges that may be associated with that. And I imagine one of the significant hurdles in these cases might be proving causation and attributing specific climate harms to urban areas. What do you anticipate these legal challenges to be in this regard?
So one of the challenges of climate litigation in general is that those seeking to hold anybody accountable for climate harms will struggle to prove who exactly is the factual cause of a climate harm, because climate change is so very complex and a range of factors come together to result in damages for climate harms. So houses in vulnerable areas that are destroyed by hurricanes, children drowning in disastrous floods, those impacts are the result of many different factors combining to lend that result, that awful result. And so what's happening is that we're seeing the field of climate attribution science emerge so as to be able to pinpoint those responsible for extreme weather events and how impacts could have been prevented or reduced. However, a challenge for litigants is that the necessary scientific evidence isn't always easily accessible to people who are first and hardest hit by climate change in urban areas. And of course, those people are typically the most vulnerable in society, impoverished communities living in areas that are at risk. So, of course, proving causation will be a huge hurdle and will require the scientific community to come together with the legal community to provide support to communities to promote climate action on the part of cities.
Okay, so considering those challenges, how do you think successful or even the potential threat of climate litigation against cities could influence future urban planning and policy in South Africa?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it goes to the point that the value of litigation is, again, a lot about what happens outside of the courtroom. But climate litigation has this amazing storytelling role that legitimizes concerns about climate change and the harms it causes. And that can, of course, change political relationships. It can shift understandings of communities' concerns. And it's that important role that has had policy influence already in our country. And so we've seen that there's this growing recognition that climate change is a relevant factor that must be taken into account in environmental governance decisions in order for those decisions to be consistent with the Constitution. And that's already an example of a law and policy change that's arisen because of climate litigation, including for municipalities. But I would hope that climate litigation, whether threatened or actual, would promote better climate mitigation measures. In other words, measures that reduce emissions or prevent emissions, and better adaptation measures. In other words, measures that could make cities more resilient to the impacts of climate change. Currently, there is incredible research by Nonhlanhla Ngcobo, who illustrates that municipal councillors are not necessarily acutely aware of the challenge of climate change, of the need to implement effective environmental policies, And we need municipal councillors, so those in the political level of municipalities, to take more cognizance of climate change as an existential threat. And hopefully climate litigation can be an impetus to achieve that. So municipal managers would hopefully be more aware of how significant climate change is as a threat to all of their other KPIs. And if they're serious about those KPIs, they need to address climate change in addition to fulfilling their more specific obligations to people in their cities.
Thank you, Prof. So as you have said, I think the message that comes out more as climate change is but one tool in a whole broad arsenal of tools that may be used for local climate change governance. And I think it's interesting to think about how these cases or how one city's action might ripple out beyond just the cities involved. So, in a broader sense, and generally speaking, how do you see climate change litigation against cities impacting either local or global climate policies?
Well, one really nice example we've seen in New York City is a shift for the city to divest from fossil fuel companies for their pension funds. And I think that that's a really good example of how cities can put pressure on fossil fuel companies who are driving climate change globally, to incentivize those fossil fuel companies to transition to better ways of doing things. So that is one example we're already seeing is a policy shift of divestment from harmful industries that are contributing to climate change. But we do have a lot of wonderful laws and policies globally. So of course the Paris Agreement, globally the UN Convention on Climate Change, and there are emerging laws like the Plastics Treaty, that of course plastics is made primarily from oil and gas. So there's a whole bunch of efforts underway in the law to take climate action using the law. I think climate litigation against cities is part of that bigger picture of how cities can really focus on local impacts, because of course most of the impacts that people experience happen within cities. And if we are able to get cities to start the ball rolling, we can hopefully, as you say, have a ripple effect into the broader national and global policy space.
Thank you, Prof. So finally, as we look to the future, how do you think climate litigation against cities will shape the broader movement for environmental justice and sustainable urban development in South Africa?
So there's a lot of scholarship from Lisa Chamberlain, Melissa Faree, and others on how climate litigation is particularly useful as part of broader mobilization efforts towards social and environmental justice. Essentially, climate litigation acts as a pressure point that can promote legislative and policy reforms that take into account the needs of the most vulnerable in a time of climate change. So if claims are made for damages against cities, cities will need to start accessing funds to put in place measures that enhance their resilience in relation to the impacts of climate change. And to be reasonable, those measures, as required by the Constitution, would have to be directed towards the most vulnerable in society first, in terms of constitutional judgments such as Grootboom. And cities, through climate litigation, could also be influenced to listen more actively to those most vulnerable and co-produce solutions that empower people to cope with climate change risks. This could look like cities adopting indigenous practices to govern stormwater drainage instead of more Western models that are not very adaptable and aren't necessarily suitable to South African cities. It could involve shifting developmental agendas within cities, for instance, from harmful industrial agriculture practices to agroecology by small-scale Black farmers that promote food security and are more sustainable and less greenhouse gas emitting. It could look like empowering and supporting communities within cities to produce small-scale renewable energy through new technologies, as opposed to reliance on large-scale infrastructure projects. So I hope we will see climate litigation catalyze and strengthen mobilization towards a more just and sustainable society in South Africa, including building alliances across existing human rights and grassroots movements to give rise to some of these positive developments. And then cities, on their part, could also be proactive. They could seek to hold polluters liable for damages or harm within their municipalities, such as coastal cities could sue polluters relative to sea level rise due to climate change. And they could, as is occurring elsewhere in the world, hold multinational corporations who extract and burn fossil fuels and deceive the public about the effects of doing so accountable through climate litigation. And this is happening in New York City and elsewhere in the world, and I think would be a wonderful way for cities to take the lead in the fight against climate change.
Thank you very much, Prof. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our session today. So many things that we have learned. Thank you very much, Prof. Murcott, for sharing your insights today and for such an enlightening and packed discussion. I really enjoyed this session and I learned a lot on climate change litigation and how cities could face this type of litigation in the future. I'm sure our listeners enjoyed it too and gained a lot of insight. To our audience, please remember to like, follow, share, subscribe, and also to interact with us and our guests on social media. You can continue the conversation with us and our guests on Twitter at Sarge Kless, on Facebook as Sarge Chair in Cities, Law and Environmental Sustainability, and on LinkedIn as Sarge Kless. Thank you for listening to CLESTalk, Law for Sustainable Cities, and look out for our next podcast airing soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much.